right, let's take a look at section 3, which is co-cultures and communication. So we're going to answer the question, we're going to think about the question as we go through this. How do co-cultural factors affect interpersonal communication? So basically, how you view yourself and how you relate to other people comes from your identity, your cultural identity and your co-cultural identity. So we're going to look at some of the major factors that influence, that shape your cultural identity. And because they shape your cultural identity, they shape the way you perceive other people and the way that you communicate with other people. So here are the major ones that we're looking at. The first two go together, usually race and identity. And basically, race, it's a social construct. Social scientists, and you know, I believe this also, feel that race is not it's not a useful term because it doesn't really tell us a lot about people. It has no biological basis, all right? The genes influencing skin color have nothing to do with the genes influencing hair form, eye shape, blood type, musical talent, athletic ability, or forms of intelligence. Knowing someone's skin color doesn't necessarily tell you anything about him or her. Now, I realize we live in the United States, and so we identify people by race. We ask people to identify themselves by race. This is something that is not done in all countries. And so, I mean, well, I say it's not a useful term. I mean, in some ways I lie because it's such an integral fact of being an American. Ethnicity, I think, is more relevant. It is the degree to which a person identifies with a particular group, usually on the basis of nationality, culture, or some other unifying perspective. Okay, so people don't, you know, maybe we want to simplify people, and we want, or we when I say we, human beings, if we can simplify things, we think it's going to make things simpler and easier, and that's just not true. So they give the example of Barack Obama. His father was Black, Kenyan. His mother was white. He lived in Indonesia. He lived in Hawaii, in California, in New York, in Chicago, in Washington, D.C. So this term intersectionality is an interesting one. It describes the interplay of social categories, including gender, race, and socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and disability. So we don't want to define or categorize people based on one aspect of who they are. So they use some great examples of Meghan Markle and also Alicia Keys, who have come from a mix of backgrounds. You know, as I've told the class, you know, my husband's from Niger, he is Black, I am white, our children are biracial, and they don't always have that's not always an option when we were filling out paperwork for the kids. Like, sometimes you could only check one. As time has gone on, you've been allowed to check more than one. But, you know, frequently when my husband would fill out an application for a job and they would ask for his race, and he would check other and write human. And I think that's probably why he didn't get called back for interviews. But, you know, why not? Okay. So what I liked was Alicia Keys, who summed it up by, my mixed race background made me a broad person able to relate to different cultures. So remember, we're looking at these relatively important co-cultures, and we're thinking about how does it impact us, how does it impact others in terms of communication. So then we have gender identity and sexual orientation, and how things have changed over time. When I was in high school, nobody was out. Maybe they were to a close friend, but the being gay or lesbian was such a stigma, no one would talk about it. It's becoming much more talked about. I'd like to say it's becoming more acceptable, but I'm not a member of the LGBTQ plus group, so I only see it from the outside. But what were they saying? 1 in 5 hate crimes in the United States target others on the basis of their sexual orientation. So that's pretty major. So while things are getting better, it's not perfect. Okay. The third one would be age and generation. Uh, in the United States and most Western cultures really worship youth. And if you're a culture that thinks that being young is where it's is the best thing in the world, then anyone who is older is that co-culture is not valued. And they've said, it seems especially aging women seem to have it worse. I mean, you look at Hollywood; they're always saying that there really are no good roles for a woman over 40 unless she looks like she's 25. Okay, but let's think about how this impacts communication. Frequently, I like this one. Older adults who are treated as less capable than their peers tend to perceive themselves as older and less capable. Okay, so if you're an elderly person and you see that you are somehow being discriminated against, do you speak up? Well, if you do, then you might be seen as bitter or cranky. So that perpetuates the stereotype. But I thought it was really interesting when they were looking at the workplace and talking about millennials, who millennials are less likely to form a lot of connections at work. That's not what their interest is not to form a lot of workplace connections. They've got their own life outside of work. They are more tend to have a strong desire for achievement, so they want clear guidance on how to do a job, but then they want to be left alone, and when the job is done, they want praise. And someone from like a baby boomer boss, no okay boomer jokes please, feels that what, I shouldn't have to give such step-by-step instructions on how to do something that this person should know. To me, this comes down to the all the unspoken. I shouldn't have to say this. We will talk about this a lot more in chapter 6 when we talk about language. The assumptions we make that I shouldn't have to say something. Okay, and they very likely also believe that no news is good news. So if you've done a good job, I'm not going to praise you. I'll let you know if you did something wrong. Okay, so what do we do in that? When you've got people from different generations trying to communicate with each other, I think I'd like to talk about this a little bit more in class. Any suggestions for how communication can become smoother? And then the fourth one, nope, 1, 2, 3. Yep, the fourth one is about ability and disability. 1 in 4 U.S. adults lives with a disability that affects major life activities. So, how, if a person has a disability, how do they fit into an organization? Do they can de-emphasize the difference? Um, Basically, people do not want to be generally do not want to be defined by their disability. It is a part of who I am. It is not who I am. However, as with any other co-culture, frequently, and they give the example of people in the deaf community, forming strong ties with people in your co-culture can be very rewarding. So here's a story. A couple of years ago, when I was teaching public speaking, I had a student in my class. She had taken interpersonal communication with me and then continued on and took public speaking, and she was deaf. And I reached out to colleagues who taught public speaking, and I said, I haven't dealt with this before. Does anyone have any tips for how I can effectively deal with this? In public speaking, one of the things a person is evaluated on is volume and gestures. So basically what was happening is when my student was giving her speech, she was signing it and her interpreter was actually speaking it. And so I wasn't sure how to go about, who am I actually evaluating? And I had one of my colleagues whose response was, "Oh, having students with disabilities in my class has always been so rewarding because they're such wonderful people." And I thought, you're not seeing the person. You're seeing a category of person. And to me, that becomes stereotyping. That's no longer about making a generalization. That is a stereotype. Well, and obviously what I did was I talked with the student and with her interpreter, and I got a better understanding. And then the interpreter made me realize that when she spoke louder, it was because that was what my student was indicating by how she was signing. So it became easier to do. Okay, anyways, the fifth co-culture we're going to look at is socioeconomic status. The United States generally prides itself on being a classless society. We don't have the nobility. We don't have the peasants. However, we do classify people based on socioeconomic status or socioeconomic background. And that has a big impact on how people communicate. I like the example that they give where working class students who have been taught to respect authority and value interdependence would be less comfortable with individualistic self-expression. So you come from a home that tells you, look, if you want to get ahead in this world, you have got to listen to what your boss tells you and say, okay, that's what I'll do. And you work with people to get the job done. And then you come into a college classroom and the professor is saying, I want you to challenge me. If you don't think I said I wasn't clear, let me know. And the person is like, how can I do that? That's not how I was taught to communicate. So do I want to talk about that now? Or, okay, another aspect would be first generation students, college students. You come from a culture where no one else in the family went to college. And so there's probably a certain kind of language that you speak at home, and then you go to the college and you learn a different way of communicating with people. Then you come back home. If you use that language of the college, then you're seen as putting on airs or trying to be somebody that you're not. So, this has a big impact on how we communicate with other people. All right. This is about co-cultures and communication, and then we're going to move on to section 4 in just a couple minutes.